All right, well, my plan of recording my lunchtime lecture didn't work because the sound wasn't on. So I'm redoing this lecture on immigration with sound. Presumably that's working. It wasn't that good of a lecture anyway, so this is probably better. I was a little bit hurried, and there was probably going to be a lot of like gnat sound in the background, and people were asking questions, and we'll see. I'll set some strict parameters for future lunchtime reviews or X block reviews, like tomorrow or whatever, and hopefully it'll be a bit. It was a learning curve. So here I am. Okay, back in the studio. Oh, bubbly. Got some Topo Chico to keep me hydrated. And let's get through this quickly. So, again, this is a thematic lecture. In class this week, I'm lecturing on the American Revolution, the ideas behind it, because that's an important event. But I also want to keep with the thematic stuff. So this is on immigration. Immigration is a theme that is you're going to encounter in some way, shape, or form on the AP test, no doubt about that. So it's important to know how it works. Um, a big part of American history is immigration, um, uh, but for both good and unfortunately bad, insofar as nativist policies and politics and anti-immigrant sentiment is always around, as we'll see in this lecture. So again, we'll see the immigrant groups change, but we will see a lot of continuity between the different time periods we're going to look at here. So let's do it. Okay, John Adams, second president of the United States after Washington. He's a Federalist. And he passes the Alien and Sedition Acts. And these are very much the first anti immigrant pieces of legislation. They're not going to be the last, obviously. We'll get through this quickly and you'll learn that. So I'll just put them all up here for us to see. So effectively, this is a political hit job, I think, as they say. The newly arrived immigrants are more likely to vote for the Democratic Republicans. This is Thomas Jefferson. Um, so you want less newly arrived immigrants voting. So the Naturalization Act changes the time frame to get naturalized and then obviously subsequently vote. The Alien Act makes it easier to deport these aliens. And then the Sedition Act censors newspapers. So John Adams is not messing around. I mean, he's pretty like this is the kind of strong executive power play that certainly TJ and the Democratic Republicans were wary of. Another reason why this is happening has to do with these. It's targeting actually a lot of the immigrants are French, and obviously Jefferson being the francophone doesn't like that. Adams being the anglophone is more comfortable with it and also wants more English immigration. So they don't like it. Um, Thomas Jefferson knows it's against the Constitution, but tough luck, buddy. There's no judicial review yet. So that's Marbury versus Madison, 1803, that establishes judicial review. So what are you going to do? He kind of like, he stomps his feet a little bit. And then he writes something. The Virginia Kentucky resolutions basically says that, if there's a law at the federal level that states don't like, they can nullify the laws. This doesn't have anything to do with immigration, but it does have him responding to the Adams administration passing these Alien and Sedition Acts, which are about immigration. Obviously, this nullification theory is going to become relevant again, most famously with the Civil War, but also with the nullification crisis during the Jackson presidency. Um, so again, this will be relevant later. Jefferson wins in the Revolution of 1800, returns the country to, as he would say, first principles. We have something that the United States celebrated for a very long time, the peaceful transition of power. which the United States did have beginning in 1800 and had it for quite some time, but not anymore. Okay, quickly, all this coming at you. So this is the early republic. So this is now we're post Jefferson. We're into Madison, Monroe. Industry is growing. Immigration is subsequently growing, and in the Northeast, that is to say, like New England, New York, they see a lot of immigrants coming to work in newly kind of nascent or emerging industries. And it's big numbers, way bigger than what we saw in previous decades. 50,000 a year in the 1830s, mostly from Northern Europe. We begin to see the beginning. We begin to see what is the first wave of Irish migrants in the 1830s. This really ramps up in the late 1840s because of the potato famine. The British are terrible. They're oppressive, awful rulers, and their policies actually are starving the Irish people. So they flee. They arrive without money, they arrive without skills, and this is the first immigrant group that is like that. We'll see a lot of immigrant groups coming to the United States, right? The poor, the weary, right? The masses, kind of not the earlier kind of immigrant groups that came with capital. And even during this time period, the kind of immigrants that you get from Germany or Scandinavia are different, as I'll say in a slide. Um, the Irish are not met with open arms. They suffer from the same kind of anti-Irish prejudice that they suffered from in Ireland, because largely the United States still has a very English culture. It's anti-Catholic. The Irish are considered like not quite, well, yeah, white, but not quite. They're really not considered white yet, so they face a lot of discrimination. And again, coming over, they don't have skills, they don't have money, they're working in factories, living in cities. So that's the Northeast. In the Northwest, a different thing is happening. This is far closer to the kind of Republican ideal of, yeoman farmers or small holding farmers. Remember the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. Those are free labor states, so no slavery. And you get a lot of migrants coming from Germany, Scandinavia, and they're leaving. They're not fleeing persecution. They're not they're not hungry, starving, right? Colonized subjects. There's social unrest in Germany. A lot of people are leaving for that reason. There's all kinds of weird inheritance laws, of primogeniture, the firstborn son, and all that kind of stuff. So if you're the secondborn son, tough luck. But you have money, you have skills. Some of them are, artisans. They move into artisan crafts and things like that. So we have different kinds of immigrant groups. It's not just like immigration, right? Immigrant groups are always a little different, but we see these subtle factors repeating. Some groups come over with, the financial wherewithal, with capital, with skills. Some come over without those things. And this is in the 1840s, 50s, we see the first real split there between the kind of haves and the have-nots. And what do we get? We get nativism. This is kind of nativism 1.0. Most famously or infamously embodied in the Know Nothing Party, which is a anti-immigrant party that emerges in the kind of like the space after the Whig Party has kind of fallen apart. It's pre-Republican. It's a little bit Federalist. And we see a lot of anti-immigrant violence anti-immigrant sentiment, I should say, and violence, largely aimed at the Irish. So that is our kind of first famous nativist party, is anti-Irish in the 1840s. And with immigration and with nativism, right, there's also another side of this coin. I've mentioned this several times in lectures as you prepare for thinking about how to write a DBQ in the AP exam. If you're talking about if you have a question about immigration and you're writing about immigration, you can always argue that, but you can, for nuance, you can argue the other side of the coin, which is nativism, right? While many immigrants came to the United States seeking, new opportunities or land that they didn't have in continental Europe, nativists met many of these immigrants, the Irish in particular, with hostility and blah blah blah. So like, just think of that when you're writing. If you want to incorporate nuance into your argument, is ask what's the flip side of the coin here. While the colonists saw the proclamation line of 1763 as a violation of their liberties and their ability to colonize the Ohio River Valley, from the British perspective, the proclamation line was an attempt to avoid another conflict with France. So again, ask what the flip side is. And with immigration, the flip side is nativism. And with immigration, another flip side is labor organizing. A lot of these laborers are coming over to the United States, having been kind of politically conscious, politically active. The 1840s is a time of kind of tumult and revolution in Germany. Some of these immigrants, the Germans in particular, would have read Marx. But English working class migrants, Scots Irish, are all coming over. Many of them, they're not just like dumb country bumpkins. They're coming over from a kind of radical political tradition, and they're adding that tradition to what is undoubtedly an organic American organizing tradition. 1842 is a big moment in this history in that the Supreme Court decision of Commonwealth versus Hunt actually allows for the organizing of peaceful unions. This is labor unions. It doesn't much matter to American industry. They still oppose unions really tooth and nail. And it really isn't until the New Deal, right, 100 years later, that we'll get actual unions as a nationally accepted and legal thing. And their power is pretty fleeting, right? It's only really a few decades that unions have a lot of power, and then we're suddenly back to the kind of 1840s. Urban life, people are moving from the country to the city. People are moving from abroad to the city. And when you have a lot of people in one place, and people are being exploited, you get slums, you get rentership, you get all kinds of problems that are legitimate problems. And as we'll see later on in some slides about the 1880s, there's two different ways of thinking about the problems that emerge in cities. The one is the moral problem, and this is the most common in the 1840s. These people are degenerates. There's something wrong with them, right? That's a kind of moralist argument, racist and nativist as well. The other argument is, of course, the economic argument, which is these people don't make a lot of money, so they have to live in this cramped apartment. And it's messy because there's no city services they just don't exist, right? One is maybe a little bit more based in evidence than the other. You can guess which one. Here's a cartoon that is, again, a question the other day or earlier today about, how widely circulated was this cartoon? It was fairly widely circulated, but more to the point, it evokes a sentiment that would not have been uncommon in the 1860s. And this is, again, reading this image like a text, right? We are like a giant kind of standing in like Canada. And you see in the background, you can kind of see the Gulf of Mexico and railroad tracks crisscrossing the United States. And on the West Coast, we have the immigration peril of the West Coast, the Chinese. On the East Coast, you have the immigration peril of the East Coast, the Irish. They are gobbling up Uncle Sam from head to toe. And then as you see in the third of the triptych, it is the Chinese migrant that ultimately eats the Irish as well, saying ultimately, obviously, right, that the Chinese immigrant is a bigger problem to the United States. So again, this is something that is common and certainly common of the 1860s. Irish were a problem beginning in the 1840s, but it's the Chinese from the 1860s on. They kind of take center stage as the immigrant group that is targeted for exclusion, violence, etc. So the Irish start to become white, as it were, and they move up the kind of social ladder, and the Chinese take their place at the bottom. So about that. Why are the Chinese here? Well, as I'll show you in a slide. Well, let's actually just let me start with this slide. Slides are out of order a little bit. They come over for mining, gold and silver at first. It's a fairly diverse group of people. I mean, it's all men, but Chinese, Mexican, white, Chilean. There's all kinds of people, and the gold it's not abundant. But placer mining is pretty common. This is what you all Californians do when you're in elementary school or whatever. You go sift through the gold or whatever. You see these numbers, right? 1849, there's about 300 Chinese in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is basically there's not much outside of that for California. By 1852, you have 20,000 Chinese in all of the state of California. That's indicative of a real increase of Chinese migrants coming to the United States. Um, uh, the gold becomes more rare, and mining moves to lode mining, which is like blowing up hillsides and like shooting hoses on it and stuff. You can't just do that on your own. So suddenly these miners become effectively wage laborers, right, working for a mining company. And the Chinese are used to break up strikes, to get, different workers kind of pitted against one another. Again, this is just kind of simple, right? When you have the resources that are more scarce, you're going to get this kind of competition. So that's the 1840s into the 1850s. Most famously, the 1860s is a time where the railroads are built by Chinese coolie labor that is taken from China, encouraged to emigrate, to leave China under often suspicious or dubious labor contracts that people think they're going to get more money than they are. They think the labor conditions are better than they are, and then they get here, and it's a kind of exploitative labor form. There's no more slavery, right? So again, the railroad is in the north. There wouldn't have been slavery anyway. But in terms of a form of labor exploitation, coolie labor is kind of the new form of labor exploitation in the latter half of the 19th century, and this is possible because of new technology. You can move people a lot faster with railroad to build the railroad. You can also move people a lot faster with, the ships are faster. The time it takes to cross the Pacific has been reduced significantly. Post travels faster, so people can, what often happens is companies will pay a Chinese migrant to write a letter saying how great it is, right? How it's like the Golden Mountain. It's all this money. The labor is easy, and someone gets some money for writing that letter, and then they copy it, send it back to China, and get more people coming over under false uh, pretenses. The Burlingame Treaty normalizes relations with China, so this is to encourage Chinese migration. Again, European powers are trying to carve China up as a target for imperial conquest. So the United States says we're not going to do that. We recognize your sovereignty. We'll set up diplomatic relations, and we want you to encourage immigration from really from the southeast of the country in particular, where it's very a lot of the population center effectively is in the southeast, and there's all kinds of conflict happening there. So people start leaving to build the railroads. And we start to see a backlash. The first anti-Chinese act is the Page Act, which strangely, it might seem, forbids the immigration of prostitutes or undesirable women. There's not that many women at all in the West, but there are a lot of men, and there are a lot of young white men who are moving west to search out their fortune. And in a time of emerging scientific racism that says the Anglo-Saxon, right, the white race is better than all other races, what you can't have in the West is mixed race children. So the Page Act effectively is more about policing whiteness the boundaries of whiteness than it is about policing the borders of the country or excluding the Chinese. Chinese Exclusion Act is a bigger deal. This is the first law to discriminate against a group of people based on race and class. It's Chinese laborers in particular that are targeted. Diplomats are excluded, business people are excluded, students are excluded from the specific piece of legislation. All these three groups realize pretty quickly that, like, if you're Chinese, you're also going to be a target of violence. But that's not in the law itself. That's a result of the law, right? And this is pretty consistent through time, American history, that when you have at the federal level, you have legislation or political rhetoric that is anti whatever, whoever the group is, one of the most tangible, palpable effects is that it increases actual violence against that group of people, right? So this is the case with the Chinese in the 1880s. It's the case with the Irish in the 1840s, with even Mexican Americans in the 1990s and 2000s, and obviously in our current moment, the anti-Asian violence is in no small part influenced by rhetoric at a national level that is very fast and loose with labeling, what is foreign, and then coronavirus stuff and all this. So again, we have a template for this in the Chinese Exclusion Act, in that, like, rhetoric at a federal level does affect anti-immigrant action at a local level. Gary Act is the first law to make people carry a photo ID. 1892. We take this for granted now in the 21st century, but the Gary Act is the first. And again, as I've said, what is the cause? What is the effect? It doesn't really, it reduces immigration a little bit, but it doesn't address, if there's demand for labor in the United States, you're going to have a demand for laborers. If there's negative factors in southeastern China, that's a push factor for immigration. If you don't address push and pull factors, people are going to leave, right? What it does, as I've said, is increase anti-Chinese violence. We've done this next slide already, so let's talk very briefly here about economic change. What's happening now, fast forwarding a little bit to the 1870s and the end of the 19th century. Again, think about the nuance point here. If we're going to make an argument about nativism and kind of racism of any kind of type against immigrants, why do people think this? Why are people willing to believe the kind of nativist policies of the time period? Because the economy is changing fast. The United States of 1870 does not look like the United States of 1850 or even 1860. And the economy is changing fast. Things are industrializing. The scale of work is increasing dramatically. The output, the pollution, there's all kinds of ways in which society is changing. And what is the most visible kind of thing that you associate with this change? It's the immigrant, right? The newly arrived immigrant, right? They symbolize this changing economy, this changing demographic structure, all of this stuff. So this is why, again, I'm not trying to sympathize with the nativists, but you have to understand why people think what they think. It's very hard to get angry at an abstract economic system or, broad glacial demographic changes. Or changes in the way, living patterns or something like that. You can't get angry at that stuff, but you can get angry at, like, those people over there. And when a politician says they're the reason all this bad stuff is happening, people do tend to believe that, right? Because it's a simplistic answer. But it's a simplistic answer to a very complicated problem. So more to that point, the kind of Janus-faced or two-faced, two-sided image of the immigrant, and this goes for the 1840s with the Irish, Chinese, Mexican immigrants, Central American immigrants, the Italians, Jewish immigrants, you name it. That we have this kind of contradictory narrative of what an immigrant, right, as a kind of like imagination, a thing in your imagination is, right? They're dangerous, but they're also fleeing persecution. They're lazy, but they're going to take your job. They're looking for a handout, also going to take your job. They're anti-American. They are American. So all of this stuff is relevant because it's a contradictory kind of discourse. To that end, here, um, anti-immigrant politics. Again, as I've just gone over this, right? So why they work, why people are apt to believe them, is because they make an abstract problem real by saying, those people are the reason that you feel uncomfortable. Those people are the reason that it's not like it was when you were a kid. And that plays on very intimate fears. It also kind of creates an American identity that always is like back there in the past. We'll see this with the Johnson-Reed anti-immigration law of the 1924, that it, very clearly says what it means to be American exists, 40 years ago, way back in 1880. It doesn't ultimately work in the end, anti-immigrant politics. They don't fix the economic problems. They don't address the demographic changes. But they don't address the push and pull factors of immigration. And they're always kind of like, we can look at the score sheet of history here. Anti-immigrant politics is always going to be like a big fat L. If you believe in that kind of the stuff, and it's a pretty, it's there are no exceptions to that. So again, it in the long run does not pay dividends for anyone, right? The immigrant, the American-born person who has kind of lost their job or whatever. It doesn't pay dividends for the politician, for political rhetoric, etc. But it does emerge in American history from time to time. Most famously with the immigration quotas of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which you have here, the quotas here, heavily weighted towards Northern and Western Europe. You see the numbers here, right, in red being Northern and Western European immigration, and blue being Southern and Eastern European. And this is why they peg the numbers to the 1880 census in 1924. They don't peg it to the 1920 census because that would look like this, right? They don't peg it to the 1910 census because that would look like that. They go all the way back to 1880, and they make the percentages based on that year. So obviously, this is a pretty transparent attempt to make immigration whiter, more Northern European, more Western European. And then meanwhile in Asia, just like if you just can't come, like you just can't come. Anyone from Asia can't come. The Philippines is an exception because the Philippines is a colony of the United States. Japan is somewhat of an exception because in the Gentleman's Agreement, the United States agrees to not have anti-Japanese immigration laws, and Japan agrees to not have any Japanese migrants leaving. So it's a face-saving effort by both countries. The other main thing to talk about with respect to immigration in American history in the late 1800s and then into the early 1900s is pseudoscience and scientific racism. Social Darwinism is the biggest offender here, and this is basically like the best adapted, most successful, right? It's survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest was actually a term, as I've said. Herbert Spencer, the scientific racist, not Darwin, is the first to write that phrase, but it sticks. It's very popular, so much so that Darwin includes it in his second edition of The Origin of Species. Why is it wrong? Natural selection is legit, right? Biology is a real science. Natural selection is, as far as we can tell, how it works. Applying that to culture, human beings in their culture, applying that to the economic systems that are made up, right, that we create as humans, is not real science. It's pseudoscience. But it, again, just like the anti immigrant rhetoric, what it does is it gives you a very easy answer. Why do these people have big factories and those people don't? Because those people are not civilized. Oh, that was easy, right? It's for it. This is ideology for dumb people, right? Whether it's nativist policies or it's kind of pseudoscience stuff. The 19th century has a lot of kind of like, well, even into our modern time, right? Dumbed down answers. To very complicated problems. And social Darwinism is a big one in this time period that is used to justify the inequalities that are apparent and emergent and increasing because of colonialism and because of the kind of carving up of the underdeveloped or undeveloped world. Um, a brief. I mean, I guess we don't need to get into the kind of Spencer. Yes, Spencer applies evolution to capitalism. Darwin has been critiqued for actually already applying capitalism to evolution. There's a lot of stuff that is like English political economy, 19th century English political economy, about competition, about thrift, about waste, stuff that is very much circulating in economic discourse when Darwin is writing Origin of Species, and he takes that stuff and he suddenly is applying it to animals, right? So like there already is a kind of like Darwin's. It's not a purely objective analysis. It's been kind of informed by an economic view that is uh, uh, the in style, I suppose, at the time period. The other pseudoscientific form, and there's lots we're not going to get into, craniometry and all kinds of stuff like that, and phrenology, the kind of bumps of your head, or measuring the inside of your skull. Social Darwinism is the big one, and then the other one is eugenics. So where uh, social Darwinism misapplies biology to human populations. Eugenics misapplies genetics to human populations, right? And this is the kind of the heritability of traits that matter, like intelligence, like thrift, hard work, working hard, and it leads to a lot of very bad things. Ultimately, eugenics has its apex with Nazi Germany. That the Nazi Germany is reading things like Spencer and other eugenicists, and they're saying, oh, these modern scientists of the 1920s, 1930s, are too influenced by politics. They're writing a kind of science that is not the real stuff. These older guys knew the real stuff. So very dangerous stuff, eugenics and social Darwinism. Um, again, we don't need to get into the kind of nitty gritty here. The eugenics and social Darwinists. So here I have, right, this is a kind of eugenicist image of like human types in the background. In the previous image, I had this famous French cartoon about what is the difference between barbarianism and civilization. Obviously, this is a kind of ironic take. So this has a lot to do with like empire and like the creation of empire, so the United States and the Philippines, any number of European countries in Africa. But these theories are also applied to immigrants coming to the United States. And social Darwinism and eugenics, this is the scientific basis for a lot of anti-immigrant policies. That they're saying, look, the latest science says that these people are not, they're genetically inferior, or they're not as well adapted, or their race is naturally going to die out. Is another one. They're going to kind of become extinct, and then it'll just be the Anglo-Saxon, which again, it's not. Just because you're white doesn't mean you're Anglo-Saxon. Just like Caucasian is not really like a term. I mean, unless you're like Joseph Saakashvili or Stalin is from the Caucasus Mountains, but Caucasian is not really a thing. Did this already, did the next one. Some people do try, it's not all just like nativist haters. A lot of reformers try to target immigrant communities for betterment. And there's a couple, as I've said earlier, with regard to an earlier form of immigration, we see a similar kind of bifurcation of how to reform these people. The one is moralistic. This is led by folks like Jacob Riis, who writes How the Other Half, it's a photo essay, How the Other Half Lives. Jane Addams, who founds Hull House, which is a kind of like a organization that helps immigrant women in particular. Walter Rauschenbusch is also a kind of reformer. So the moralistic reform groups say that the person is the problem. You make the person better, and you get rid of the bad morals. You teach them how to be good Protestants, get rid of their Catholicism or whatever else, and then you have these individuals who are better, and then you get rid of the problem through this kind of individualized way. The other approach is the economic approach. This is the more socialist approach, like Henry George, Edward Bellamy, and these are critics that say the problem isn't that these people are lazy. The problem is that these people don't have any money. And they don't live in a slum because they like it, or it's something part of in their moral character, the fabric of their moral character. It's because they don't have enough money to not live in a slum. And that then the solution is not individual. You're not going to fix that through going to Bible school or something like that. You're going to fix that problem through state intervention. Regulating what apartments should have windows, which is a regulation in New York City, or minimum wage laws, worker safety laws, things like that. So these are the two kind of reform movements in the late 19th, early 20th century. Fast forward to World War I. They back at it again, Espionage and Sedition Act. So remember back to John Adams, the second president of the United States. We got Alien Act again. We got Sedition Act again. In wartime, this is quite common. In times of war, that civil liberties get rolled back. The excuse being it's for the betterment, right, for the war effort. Eugene Debs, who was involved in the Pullman strikes of the late 19th century, goes to jail for sedition because he's a socialist and he wants the United States to not be involved in World War I. The Schenck versus United States Supreme Court decision of this time period, precedent setting when it comes to curtailing First Amendment rights. The Schenck decision establishes a clear and present danger, that it's a clear and present danger that is if that condition is satisfied, if an act, a piece of writing, something else constitutes a clear and present danger to the state, it can be targeted for censure. Right. This clear and present danger, we don't need to get into the arcana of Supreme Court precedent, but clear and present danger has been supplanted by imminent lawless action is the kind of phrase that we have now, and that's based on a Supreme Court decision from the 1960s. I'll get into that later. Post-war politics. So again, the United States and other European countries win. Some European countries lose. More on that when we talk about World War II. After the war, it's a time of patriotism. So folks that were not in support of the war are kind of, again, targeted, seen as unpatriotic. They've already been looked at with suspicion because, again, union organizing, labor organizing, pacifism, all of these things are associated with immigrants. And as hopefully in the last 38 minutes you've picked up on, there is a long tradition of nativism in American politics and culture that looks suspiciously upon immigrants. You have here the first Red Scare, which is the kind of first anti-communist push in American history, and this is in the 19 teens, right? So obviously right after the Russian Revolution. Oops, I've turned off my second monitor. Well, we got to just make do here. And then the Palmer raids, which again targeting people seditious groups like socialists, anarchists, things like that. Meanwhile, in 1917 to 1919, you have a series of race riots, a bit of a misnomer. It's effectively just anti-black violence on the part of white Americans. A lot of black Americans are demanding an end to Jim Crow, better jobs, and the black kind of anti-black race riots and the black civil rights demands are paired with this fear of the foreigner into like a very deadly combination in the 19 teens that is seen as potentially very threatening to the United States because there are enough black Americans who are affected by Jim Crow and enough immigrant workers who are demanding higher wages where it seems as though are we going to get another is this going to be a Russian Revolution here, right? What are we going to what is this going to lead to? um, I'm sorry, I just need to make sure that my computer's charged. I thought I had it charging, but I don't. Oh boy, oh boy. Oh, that's a phone charger. That's not going to work. Here we go. Sorry, bear with me. So you think I rehearse this? You think I record this stuff in like a mirror or something beforehand? Nah, man. One take. One take. All right, maybe it should be more than one take, but that's what you get. Adding to this, kind of the Third International, the Comintern or Communist International, says like, yeah, that the point of communism is to be worldwide. So obviously, a capitalist country like the United States says like, we don't really like that much. Nationwide strikes in 1919. There's a general strike in Seattle that just shuts the city down. So all of this stuff combines into a national sentiment for a lot of Americans of foreign, anti-red, and also anti-black. Economic recession kind of puts a kibosh on a lot of this organizing because it's no longer a demand for higher wages. It's just people are like out of work and want a job. Nativism 2.0, the peak of nativism. Oh, I've cut this off here. Does not peak in 192, maybe in like Rome or something. That should be 1924. 1924 here. The Johnson-Reed Act, which I said limits immigration to a percentage of the 1890 totals, bans undesirables. Largely, these immigrant groups are coming to cities. They are laborers and consumers. That is to say, like they're making stuff and they're consuming stuff. As I've said, they are politically conscious, politically active, and they are crowded into ghetto communities not because they have a moral kind of proclivity for living in ghettos, but rather because they can't afford to live anywhere else. Meanwhile, the kind of nativist move, literally, of this time period is to leave cities for suburbs. This depresses local economies, and they can do that because of things like rail car, trolley, bridges. So suddenly you don't need to live in Manhattan anymore. You can move out to the suburbs, which really in the 1870s, 80s is Brooklyn, right? New York hasn't kind of spread to like where now the suburbs is like Westchester County or something. In the 1880s, it's Brooklyn. So people move out. It depresses local economies. You get more ghetto communities. As you get more ghetto communities, people move out. Depresses local economies. So we start to see this kind of like spiral effect here. And again, these immigrants in this time period, the ones that the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 is targeting, are what we would call new immigrants. That is to say, ones that like are definitely not white. Right. Again, given the racial or ethnic understandings of the time period, right? Are Greeks white? Well, in the 21st century, it would seem as though they are, or Poles, or Romanians, maybe. But in the 1880s, they're not white, right? They're largely Catholic if they're from Ireland or Italy. Or they're Jewish if they're from Eastern Europe. And just like the Irish, in the 1840s, they're arriving with less capital, less skills, And it is important to note, right? They're not the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor are just trying to survive. So you at least need to have enough capital to buy the boat ticket. Um, um, and obviously, if you're well off, you ain't trying to leave either. Black Americans are also starting to migrate north. This is the beginning of the Great Migration. Begins in the 19 teens, continues on up into the 1940s. And that's what's happening in cities, and in the kind of interwar period, right? So after World War I, before World War II. Speaking of World War II and immigration, the most infamous event of the World War II time period is obviously Japanese internment. Japanese American communities are all along the West Coast. They have a very unique kind of immigration. The Issei, who are the immigrants, and then the Nisei, and then immigration just kind of gets shut off. So you have this immigrant generation and then their kids, and then that's kind of like that's it. We're just starting to get grandkids in this time period because of the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, because of Johnson Reed in 1924. It has a very unique kind of immigrant uh, uh, look. Executive Order 9906 is the order that relocates 120,000 Japanese living along the West Coast, right? So this is not Japanese in Hawaii. This is not Japanese in like Chicago or New York. It's Japanese along the West Coast, and I'll say why in a second. 62% are citizens. Again, Nisei, if you're U.S. born, after the Wong Kim Ark decision of the 1890s, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. Right, establishes birthright citizenship. As I said, excludes Japanese Hawaiians, 40% of the population. Obviously, you can't ship off 40% of your population and still have a functioning economy. Also, the Japanese population in Hawaii is far more integrated into the white community and the native community. Remember, right? Hawaii has indigenous people who live there. It's not just white and Asian, but also indigenous Hawaiians. So there's more. Basically, what we say tolerance, right? There's more understanding of Japanese Americans. Where in the West Coast, if you look here at this next image, right? This is the exclusion zone along the West Coast. For decades, American agricultural interests, all the way back to the turn of the century in the early 1900s, have been pushing to get the Japanese, you know, passing laws so they can't own property, passing laws so they, taxing them because they're competing largely in agriculture with American agricultural interests. So this is something that there have been kind of special interest groups in American agriculture pushing for, their representatives to do something about these Japanese, right? Again, American citizens in the area, and they finally win with Japanese internment. The nativists, anti-Japanese, right, win. Not a good look. But again, if you're from the East Coast, you're not targeted. If you're from Hawaii, you're not targeted because again, it's largely political. After internment, very few detainees remain. Some of them do get their property back at the expense of Black Americans who start moving into these formerly Japanese areas, right? Trying to get out of the bad neighborhoods they live in, trying to, again, achieve their American dream. They get kicked back to their ghetto communities, and as the Japanese Americans move back. White Americans that expropriate Japanese property, though, not so much, right? So Palos Verdes Peninsula is largely, before the war, Japanese farmers and fishermen, and they tried to get their property back, and because it's been taken by whites, they don't win. But they do win in Little Tokyo when it's Black Americans who move in. So again, you see a little bit of the kind of like racial kind of dynamics at play here. They eventually get redressed in the 1980s via the Civil Liberties Act, which atones for and grants reparation for each surviving internee. Ending here on what is a high point in America. If you're not a nativist, is a high point in American immigration history, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Turns out not allowing all these immigrants into the United States is not good for the economy. And then by the 1960s, you see an exploding population of highly educated professionals in India, in China, in Japan, in the Philippines. And meanwhile, the United States doesn't have enough engineers, doesn't have enough accountants, enough nurses, doctors. So this changes the law, effectively putting an end to the 1924 Reed-Johnson immigration restrictions and encourages, again, skilled workers to the United States. So again, even as we go all the way back to right the 1830s, 40s, 50s, you see a distinction between unskilled and skilled. People arriving with financial wherewithal, with capital, with skills, and those fleeing persecution. So we see that in the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, and we see it also in our contemporary kind of immigration politics, right? That it's far easier to migrate if you can get on a plane and if you speak English, if you have an advanced degree, your immigration experience is going to be easier than someone fleeing, right, a death squad in Central America. It's both going to be physically easier to do, but also there are a lot fewer hoops to jump through in terms of getting naturalization. So we'll end in 1965 because that's the major one. There are immigration reform acts in the 1980s which are significant, and then obviously it won't be on the AP exam, but the country's recent anti-immigrant nativism is another one in these, right? Ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, back and forth of American policy. Why do we study history? So that we can hear the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the nativist rhetoric in the 21st century and say, we've seen that before, and it didn't work then, and probably won't work now either. So that is immigration coming in at 51 minutes and 51 seconds.